Hey everybody, Jem Schofield here, and welcome to the Canon EOS R5 and R6 video training series. The purpose of this series is to focus on the video-specific features of these cameras, and in this particular video, we're going to be talking about both the R5 and R6 and the high-speed recording options in the cameras, so let's go. Now we're going to talk about high speed, sometimes called off-speed recording, and we're going to talk about the options that are available in both the R5 and the R6. So let's start with the R5. We're going to go into the menu, the first menu, Shoot 1, and under Movie Record Quality, Movie Record Size, we're going to talk about our off-speed recording in this particular mode. So what we can do here, if we're set up in NTSC, is we can choose 59.94 frames per second recording in either 4K-D or 4K-U for UHD. This is what most people are going to be using because it's a native 16:9 aspect ratio. And then we'll go down to our second row and we'll choose 59.94. And then as covered in the recording options video, we would choose either all I or IPB. I'm going to leave it in IPB for now. And then we'll set that to our option. Now, when we're recording in 59.94, we are recording audio to the camera at the same time. So if you need that for off-speed recording, this is going to be your option, whether, again, in 4K DCI or 4K UHD. The other time that you might use 59.94 if you don't want off-speed recording is if you were shooting something like sports or nature and you wanted things to feel very realistic and you wanted to be capturing at a higher frame rate. But very oftentimes for us in our productions, what we're doing is we're recording in, let's say, 59.94 and then going into a timeline that is set to either 29.97 or 23.98. And we are conforming in post-production that footage to that frame rate, and hence we get slow motion footage. So for instance, if we were going 59.94 to 23.98 in post-production, we would actually slow down that footage. We would set it to 40% speed, and then we would be conforming to that frame rate correctly. The other thing you have to remember when you change your frame rate is we have to talk about our shutter speed, because if we're shooting at 23.98, we tend to set our shutter speed to a 50th of a second. So we are exposing each of those frames for half the amount of time. That cadence, that kind of motion blur, that look is what we expect. If we're shooting in a frame rate of 29.97, we would go ahead and change that to a 60th of a second. If we're shooting at essentially 60 frames per second, 59.94, we're going to go ahead and essentially double that, and we would set our shutter speed to a 1/25th. So you have to factor that into the exposure that you're getting inside of the camera, and things will have to change in terms of your lighting and how much light is coming into the camera, or you're going to have to make other adjustments in camera, for instance, to your ISO. If we switch the video system over to PAL, and as you can see here are my recording options, you'll see now in terms of high speed, I can set that to 50 frames per second. And if I set that and step out, instead of having my shutter speed, like I did for 59.94 at a 1/25th, I'll set that to a 1/100th when I'm shooting at 50 frames per second. So it's just a little bit of math that you have to remember and apply that so that you have that correct motion in your captured image. And it's important because when you conform to 29.97 or 23.98, you still want to make sure that you're exposing each of those frames for half the amount of time so that that motion is correct. Now, the next option in the R5 when it comes to high-speed recording is high frame rate. And when we go into this menu, it's really a one-trick pony, but it gives you the ability to record in 119.88 frames per second, rounded up 119.9 in NTSC. And it will conform this footage, once you've chosen this, to 29.97. So if you need to drop that into a timeline that's 23.98, then you'll have to do a little bit more conforming inside of post. If your final frame rate is 2997, then you're all set to go. We go into movie record size, and we still have the option to choose between 4K DCI and 4K UHD. It's all eye recording, so the data rate is quite high when you're doing this type of recording. And you do have to be careful because it can generate a lot of heat in the camera, so you just have to watch out for your recording times and also those overheating warnings in the camera. And here we are choosing high frame rate for PAL, and we'll go in here and you'll see that we can choose, again, DCI or UHD at that 100 frames per second option as opposed to 119.9 or 119.88. And we'll say OK. And then when we step out here and we're looking at our shutter speed, because we're shooting at 100 frames per second, we want to expose those frames for half the amount of time to light. We'll change that to a 200th of a second for our shutter speed. And that's really the math you need to remember when you're doing off-speed recording. Let's go ahead now and talk a little bit about the R6. There's a lot of similarities and there are a couple of differences. So we've swapped out the R5 for the R6, and we're going to take a look at those menus quickly to see any of the differences to what we were just talking about. Most everything we've discussed applies to both of the cameras, but we do want to take a look at where things are and what they look like. So when we go into the movie recording quality settings inside of the R6 and then movie recording size, you will see that we have two options inside of here. For 59.94, we have 4K at 59.94 in UHD, and we also have full HD at 59.94. Now, of course, you can record full HD at 59.94 on the R5 as well. We just didn't go over that in that part of the video. So once you've chosen 59.94 and you're recording at that frame rate, and we go back out, it's the same thing. We want to make sure that we are choosing the correct shutter speed for the frame rate that we're recording in. So I'm going to set that to a 1/125th of a second. And we're going to go back into the menu here, and you'll see that we also have a high frame rate option in the R6, but it is quite different than the R5. If we go into there and enable it, you will see that we do not have any 4K recording options in this camera. It will switch to full HD at 119.88, rounded up 0.9 frames per second in NTSC. And then when we come back out at that higher frame rate, which is again conforming to 29.97 and being recorded in the camera at that frame rate, we can see here that our shutter speed is a 1/125th, and we're going to set that to a 2/50th of a second because of the frame rate that we're shooting in. And of course, just like the R5, we do have the option to go into the Setup To menu and change that to PAL so that we're seeing the frame rates that relate to PAL recording. So again, if I'm doing this high frame rate recording on this camera, I can change this shutter speed to a 1/200th of a second because I'm recording at 100 frames per second. And then I would make adjustments to my ISO or to my lighting in my environment to make sure I'm getting the exposure that I want based on the frame rate and the shutter speed that I have my camera set to. So there you have it. That's an overview of the high-speed recording options in both the R5 and the R6 cameras, and hopefully that will help you going forward with your productions. The goal here is always education, so I hope you learned something in this video. Thanks for watching.